So as Chris encouraged us, take a couple of deep breaths. Loving ourselves through the process of owning our own story is the bravest thing we'll ever do. Those are words written by Brené Brown. I think you've come to probably realize I really appreciate her writings. I was in conversation this Thursday morning at 7 a.m. with Kelly Shepard of our faith community, who is actually here, so she can clarify if I get anything wrong. We both shared that we've been doing some deep work around shame and shaming, correct? This is one of my favorite images. And we both realize we don't like our cone of shame or, honestly, our cone of silence around shame. Shame around our childhood, shame around growing up, shame in adulthood, workplace shame, clergy shame. Shame we put on ourselves and the shame that is put on us. Shame, shame, shame. I grew up in a shaming culture and a shaming home. Is it any wonder that I also became a part of a shaming church? I became a pastor, a professional in a church that builds its message around sin and guilt and shame. And I might add, in my conversation with Kelly Thursday morning, I experienced a little shame of my own around my Lutheran past as a clergy and the shame, the miserable shame, that I put on some of the Lutheran communities that I served. And apologies to those of you who are still Lutheran. Not all Lutherans are shaming, but I was a good one. I've spent many hours repenting of some of that shame that I cast upon people as a young clergyman. Now, many churches teach doctrines of shame without maybe really knowing it. For example, the core shame message taught in many churches is that you must be like Jesus at all times. Anything less, and you have failed yourself, and you have failed God. You don't measure up. You'll never be good enough. God will perpetually be disappointed with you. And money. You're going to talk about money today. Real Christians tithe. They give 10%. Those who don't give 10% should be ashamed of themselves. And then there's the false doctrine of original sin. The use of shame, the use of guilt has been widely used as a way and a technique to control people for millennia. Parents use shame to control behavior of their children. Teachers use shame. Church leaders use shame to increase donations and control behavior. Basically, I think culturally we are accustomed to being preached at by our parents, having fingers pointed at the children, being told that they are shameful, and then we join shame-based communities of faith because that's what's attractive to shame-filled people. Maybe it's not such a bad thing that some churches are dying. In many ways, my life has been a big shame on you. Isn't that the way it is for most of us, though, as we live on our lives? What's the foundation of our shame? What's the foundation, and where does that shame come from? Does it come from our family? Does it come from our system? Does it come from our religious system? Does it come from our educational system? Does it come from our own internal shaming system? And you know, over the last few days, I've heard a lot of people say in coffee shops and a variety of places, shame on those teachers for walking out. They should have stayed there. It shows that they don't really care about the students. Shame on you for interrupting children's education in Arizona. To that I say, pshaw. Don't shame teachers because they're doing exactly what they need to do at exactly the right time. So in my undergraduate world, my intention was to become, I know that's actually Thea that's making a sign. It's a little bit strange, but it's all good if you could read it. So in my undergraduate world, as I was approaching college, my intention was to become a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a psychotherapist, whatever path, because I needed to figure out myself, I need to figure out my family, and I really wanted to figure out the human race. So psychology today, which is kind of pop psychology, has become one of my favorite magazines, especially as I'm preparing sermons around various human issues. And recently there was an article entitled, "What We Get Wrong About Shame." And it was written by Gershon Kaufman, a well-known psychotherapist, and he said this: "Shame is the most disturbing experience individuals ever have about themselves. No other emotion feels more deeply disturbing because in the moment of shame, the self feels wounded from within." Have you ever experienced that? The self feels wounded from within. You know, we can experience shame when we burp loudly in the elevator and there are other people with us. Or we can feel chronic shame, experiencing that we're flawed, we're inferior, we're not quite what we should be. And we didn't know it until recently, and according to Psychology Today, it said that infants might be hardwired and born with the ability to experience shame. And I'm not going to go into all of it, but if you want, when you go home, Google Psychology Today and Google baby shame if you want to know more about it. So we're in the process of calling an associate pastor, and I'm assuming this associate pastor that she also will believe that we are to be a shame-free zone. When I interviewed 4 years ago, I believe I said that to the search committee, that I think spiritual communities should be shame-free. And here in this beloved community, we aspire to affirm the goodness of humanity, that each one of us created in the very divine image of God, and God said when we were created, we are very, very, very good. In fact, in a moment of choir rehearsal the other night during our offering, we're singing a medley of hymns. We're singing Amazing Grace, and kind of several of us kind of raised our hands because we were singing the first verse in the traditional fashion. And we said, well, here at First Church, we don't say that saved a wretch like me. We say that saved a soul like mine. So you may ask at this point, I haven't gotten to the reading at all, why are you talking about shame? We're supposed to be talking about resurrection. It's the 40 days between Easter and Pentecost. But as I spent time with this oh so familiar story that I have struggled with for many, many years, I realized that it has much to say about shame that I had missed. Peter, the main character in the story, I believe, is feeling some shame. In fact, quite a bit of shame. Jesus is addressing Peter's shame in the story. The shame, in fact, of all of those 7 disciples, as you heard last week, were out in the boat who were fishing and caught nothing all night long. They probably felt some shame about the fact that we can't even get fishing right. So they were invited to breakfast on the beach with Jesus. And so last week, we left off with Jesus and the 7 fishermen on the shore, gathered around the fire that Jesus had stoked. They were eating fish and bread. This was their breakfast. It was their breakfast on the beach. And then suddenly during the breakfast, as they're concluding, Jesus looks Peter in the eyes and says, "So Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me?" In fact, Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And Peter's response the first 2 times is, "Well, you know I love you." But the 3rd time, Jesus asked the question. I think Peter's a little riled up, and he says, "Come on, Master. You know everything. You know that I really love you." You know, I've been there when somebody's asking me, "Do you really love me, James?" We think the other person should know that we love them. We don't think we need to prove our love. Isn't there enough evidence that I love you? I believe Peter is anxious, nervous. He's caught off guard because Peter is still living in a place of shame. like many of us. We know our love is there, but we aren't so great at showing our love. And our object of love often does not know that we love he or she or it. Now, I assume you all know the backstory, right? Jesus predicted before he died on the cross that in those last few moments of Jesus' life that Peter would deny him 3 times. In other words, Peter would not admit when the chips were down and Jesus' life was on the line that he even knew this Jesus or was a follower of Jesus. And so I assume that Peter assumed that when Jesus pulled him aside at the breakfast, in only this, the 3rd visit with Jesus and Peter, Jesus was probably going to say, Peter, I told you so. I told you when the chips were down and my life was at stake and I was about to be killed and they were hauling me off to the political and religious leaders that your love for me would fail. Shame on you, Peter. But that's not what Jesus did. Jesus knew shame. We're told that Jesus had every human emotion that we have. So I can only assume Jesus felt some shame. And after all, Jesus was practically naked on a cross for several hours. That was incredibly shaming. But he was not shaming Peter. I think what he was doing is attempting to really pull Peter out of his own self-shame. Letting Peter know that the divine had given him the knowledge, yes, that indeed he was going to deny that he knew him. But reassuring Peter, Peter, you aren't perfect. Peter, love isn't perfect. Peter, you are human, you are flawed, you're working it out, but Peter, you're growing. So that's where this beautiful word from Brene Brown comes in. I think Peter needed to love himself enough through the process of owning his story around Jesus, his story of life, his story of becoming a fisherman and now suddenly becoming a teacher and a leader. Owning your story, my friends, is the bravest thing you can ever do. Own your story. It's the bravest thing I can ever do, to own our story. Peter, I know you love me. I know that you're on the journey. Now, Peter, own it. Live it. Like all of us. Peter, get over your shame, let go, and move on. And I love the crazy simplicity of this moment between Peter and Jesus. And all he says is, then Peter, go feed my sheep. Go feed my lambs. You know what? Don't worry about it. Just go out and do something. Go feed my crazy, ornery sheep. This is my favorite picture of the whole slide deck today. Go feed those crazy sheep. And you know what's really odd is whenever sheep come up in the Bible, when I'm in the Bible class or I don't know where I'm somewhere where sheep come up in the Bible or in the scriptures, people will always look at me as if they have the inside understanding. They'll say, Pastor, you know sheep are really dumb. You know that, right? Pastor, sheep are really dumb. And the inference is Jesus compares us to sheep, therefore humans are really dumb. I don't think that's so true. Sometimes I know the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But I think saying that is another way to shame us, right? One of my kin has a very small sheep farm down in Baldwin, Mississippi, which is a neighboring town to Boonville, Mississippi. And I would agree, the sheep are incredibly dumb, but I'll tell you, those sheep are incredibly lovable. They are simple-minded, just kind of these fluffy, furry creatures who are really intelligent in their own right and really curious. I think even more than a discussion about the IQ of sheep, it's important to see what Jesus is really saying here. I think also about our current reality in our national and our worldwide system. We are afraid. We are sheep living in fear, right? It's always good to come together on Sunday morning because at least for a moment, some of that fear dissipates and we get to celebrate and we get to sing and we get to be present with our own tribe, with our own kin. But that's the reality of the national, local, and worldwide system we're living in. The sheep are scattering and sheep are stampeding. But the other beautiful thing is that sheep are also in the streets, letting their voices be known. So really, the call today from this scripture, and there's no shame here, right, is to get over your shame. That sounds shaming. But to get over and around and through our shame and get over our fears, to get over our intrepidation and step out on faith and simply relax into the call that we've been given. Jesus said, "Fear not, O little flock, you have God in you." That's what Jesus said. He says, don't be afraid, O little flock. You've got the kingdom. You've got the kingdom. You've got the dominion of God in you. You have the power of the divine living inside. You have God justice. You have God power. You have God goodness. Now let go of the shame. Let go of your feelings of being insignificant. Live big and live out loud. And about every 3 months or so, I bring out Marianne Williamson and this statement, because I think it really applies to Peter. It applies to us. It applies to how we live in the world and how we walk in the world and how we understand ourselves. And Marianne Williamson says, you are a child of God. But then she goes on to say, your playing small does not serve the world. We are all meant to shine as children do, and I'll tell you, children in this community shine. We're all born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, but it's in every one. That doesn't mean just those of you in this building. It means those outside the building. And here's kind of my closing joke. I'm telling you, the man and the dog are definitely working together. For God's sake, Trevor, always you with that conspiracy stuff. I see you all got it. You know, this is kind of really a big conspiracy here, isn't it? This faith life. Because this is not just the man and the dog working together. This is man and God, woman and God, humanity and God, working together for a different, more beautiful, more just, more equitable world. It's like you and me and Peter and Jesus are being called to lead, to feed, not just spiritually, but also to feed physically. You and I, we are a beloved community. We're a part of a flock of sheep. And we're called to work together, God and man, God and woman, man and woman, he and she, and us and them, to feed each other, to feed the world, and to feed our brothers and sisters outside these walls. In the words of Brene Brown, I'd love to close with those again. I'd really like those to just sink deep into your heart. Loving ourselves through the process of owning our story is the bravest thing we'll ever do. And if there's anything you can say about Peter, he continued to be quite the mess, quite the hot mess. But he was brave, and he really lived into his true, authentic self. And I'd like you to share these words with me. These are words from one of my favorite authors, John O'Donohue, from the book To Bless the Space Between Us. Come home to yourself. May all that is unforgiven in you be released. May your fears yield their deepest tranquilities. May all that is unlived in you blossom into a future graced with love. And now, if you would, I'd like to read this for yourself on the next slide. Let's read together. I come home to myself. May all that is unforgiven in me be released. May all my fears yield their deepest tranquilities. May all that is unlived in me blossom into a future graced with love. May it be so. Amen.